Hi, everyone, and thank you for attending the Society of Product Safety Professionals webinar series. My name is Lawden Harp, and I will be managing the production of this webinar. If you're having trouble with Zoom, audio or visual, please send a chat to the host, which is me, and I'm going to help you as much as I can. If there's time at the end of the presentation, we will have an opportunity for question and answers with our speaker. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them via chat straight to the host, which is me. If we don't get to all of the questions, we will review and respond to all of the questions via email after the webinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce Laurel Roney from Swimways Corporation, who has put the SPSP webinar series together and will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Lawden. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to our second webinar in the 2018 SPSP webinar series. Our goal for this series is to explore topics relating to the development and maintenance of a comprehensive product safety program. Throughout the series, we will cover issues that we, as product safety professionals, all face daily as we work to establish and maintain successful programs that comply with both regulatory requirements and industry-leading practices. We at SPSP are very excited about this series and would like to extend a special thanks to our exclusive sponsor, Stericycle, for their support in making the series possible. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker. Donald Moffett has spent the last 20 years leading domestic and international product quality, product safety, and social compliance auditing teams. He is the Director of Social Compliance at Carhartt, Inc., and is revolutionizing Carhartt's product compliance program by building risk-based process around the design, development, and testing of their entire product line. And we are pleased that he has agreed to share his knowledge of risk assessments with us today. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Don.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I have a lot of slides to get through, so briefly, just to understand a little bit about the format that I normally take. My slides tend to have a lot of content, and we'll be going through them quick, but the slides will be made available in video afterwards on the SPSP website, so don't worry too much about taking notes or anything. It'll be available at later times. So let me go ahead and get started into this. So what we're going to be talking today is a few topics around designing and implementing a product risk assessment program from the experience that I've gained over my 20 years of doing a combination of consulting as well as working in the manufacturing environment and working with other product safety professionals. One of the things I've learned over time is that when you're dealing with a company brand and their financial success, there's really three pillars that you have to look at in order to support that success related to consumer products. Having compliant products are going to result in reduced recalls, lower financial concerns, and a lot less regulatory action. Having good quality is going to result in higher satisfaction, decreased returns. But what a lot of companies kind of miss is there's a disconnect between product safety and regulatory compliance. A lot of companies believe that if you meet the regulations that your products are safe, but that's not really the case. So I tend to break those out into two separate areas of regulatory compliance and product safety, because we know that if safe products are going to have a much larger success than if you have unsafe products. Now, the way companies deal with this is a lot of different ways. So most companies are aware enough to know that they need to comply with those mandatory legal requirements that are out there. And in the US, dealing with the CFRs, or dealing in Europe, the directives and regulations out there. A lot of companies understand that there are also the voluntary standards that are out there that are really smart to comply with, because there's a lot of good information in them. And if you're working to build safe products and compliant products, using those voluntary standards will go a long way also. There's also industry safety or quality standards from like AATCC in the textile industry, or NFPA in textiles for fire protection, as well as like UL for electrical safety. But what a lot of companies have understood over the years is that's not always enough. So there's some companies out there that have learned that they need to develop their own internal safety and quality standards. And they do that by either using a combination of scaled up standards. So the standard will say you have to meet this level, and so they'll set a higher level just to make sure that they meet that standard. Or in some cases, they establish their own standards based off of internal experience. Basically, something went wrong, so they're going to make sure that that doesn't happen again, and they set their own internal. The problem with those two approaches, though, is you don't always know what these standards are based off to know if that scaled up is really doing anything for you. And also from an internal experience standpoint, you have to wait for something to happen before you can learn from that. So again, not very good places to be. So more and more companies are realizing that they need to develop and comply with these essential safety standards that are based really looking on risk assessments and other related processes. And that's what I'm going to spend some time talking about today. Starting off, we're going to go through regulatory overview, a little bit of the why do we need to do this, but then get into some of the nuts and bolts of how to do that. And looking through the US regulations, the basic law that governs this here in the US is the Consumer Product Safety Act. And I'm sure most of you are aware of this law. But what it is, this is the umbrella policy that the US uses to ensure that products are safe. There's several sections within it that govern different aspects of product safety. So like, for example, Section 7 actually allows the government agency to rely on voluntary standards. So that puts voluntary standards in a whole different light when you think that they're voluntary, but if the US government can sit there and say, well, we're going to treat this as mandatory, that really doesn't make them voluntary much anymore. And Section 7 actually allows the government to do that. Section 8 allows the CPSC to outright ban items, and then, you know, what most of us are familiar with is Section 15D, which is where recalls come under, and the allowance of the CPSC to actually recall and remove unsafe products from the market. But within the regulation, there's a term of substantial product hazard, and this is really enlightening when you go into the standard, is they define that in two parts. One is a failure to comply with the applicable product safety rule. So basically, if there's a standard and the product fails to meet it, there can be a substantial product hazard. But the second part of the definition is a product defect that creates a substantial risk of injury to the public. So even within the law, they recognize that just meeting the standards is not sufficient. And the law allows them to recall products even if they meet the standards, if there's a substantial risk of injury caused by that product. So again, just meeting the standards is not enough. Now in Europe, they have a very similar law out there called the General Product Safety Directive, and this is really the foundation of the rules in Europe. But much like the Consumer Product Safety Act, they have articles that the purpose of this law is to ensure that products placed on the market are safe. But again, even in their law, Article 1, Section 2 states that where products are subject to specific safety requirements, this directive will apply only to those aspects not covered by those. So again, you think through the wording of that, and what this is saying is this is their umbrella policy where even if the standards don't go far enough to cover it, if the product is deemed to be unsafe, they are allowed to take action under this because of their umbrella policy that says, we are still going to look at everything. Now, the GPSD is actually a very interesting document to learn from. So you may say, well, we don't supply in Europe, so that doesn't apply to us. You can still learn a lot about the risk assessment process by reading some of these laws and regulations. So within the GPSD, they actually go further to define what a safe product is. And they look at a lot of different things. They look at the characteristics of the product, which is pretty obvious. But they go so far as saying that you have to look at the effect on other products if it's reasonably foreseeable that that product will be used with other products. So that raises the bar that a lot of companies don't think about is now you have to look at that interaction and understand even if your product's used with a product that you don't make, it's still your responsibility to make sure it's safe for that use if it's reasonably foreseeable to be used in that way. But the last part is really the most telling one also, is where they talk about that the categories and consumers at risk when using products, especially children and the elderly. So they even call out two of the groups that are most at risk from injury, saying you need to focus on those areas. Now, in Article 3, they even give a little bit of a roadmap where they say, okay, what do you do? How do you manage this? Well, they give you a laundry list of things to consider. You have to look at voluntary national standards. the standards in member states. But they go further. You have to consider commission recommendations that are setting guidelines. You have to look at product safety codes of good practice, the state of the art in technology, and even reasonable consumer expectations concerning safety. This is all straight out of their law. So again, if all you think is meeting a standard is enough, there's no reason for these laws to go into all of this detail of all the other things that you must consider. So the biggest question left is, how do we do that? And so the way that you do that is through risk assessments and risk assessment processes. Now, when we talk a little bit about the impact of what happens, well, the governments, their recourse is to do recalls. Looking at CPSC, you can sort of see a trend here. The government realizes they can't keep up on the standards for recalls, so they've gotten just really good at implementing recalls. So you can see how they've grown over the years, ever increasing. This is now the choice method of if a product presents a risk, you are much more likely to have it recalled now than you were 10 or 20 years ago. This isn't only in the US, in Europe. You can also see the rise in recalls over the last 10 to 15 years. And while it's starting to stable out a little bit, there's still a significant number of reporting going on, which typically leads to the withdrawal of product within Europe. Now, back in 2002, there was a company called PRTM that issued a white paper on product safety stewardship. And within that white paper, they actually had some really interesting nuggets of information where they analyzed recalls, analyzed patterns. And this chart here actually showed that over a 3-year period, as they analyzed all of the recalls that took place, with the exception of food and cosmetics that were mainly labeling issues related to the recalls, the vast majority of all other product recalls, the root cause of it was something went wrong in product development. It wasn't that the product was manufactured wrong, it was that it was designed wrong. It was a design defect. Now, this report is old. It's coming up on 16 years, and so you might think, well, that was then, we're in the now. Well, this chart here was actually just presented recently by the CPSC, and pretty much shows the exact same thing. Even over the last 5 years, when you look at the products that were involved in recalls, how many of them were regulated products, meaning that there were laws and regulations surrounding them, versus how many were considered just defective, meaning there were no laws and regulations or the products complied with it. So again, this is really telling to help us understand that just meeting the standards is not sufficient. Now, some examples of this. Nerf had an issue with this football a while ago that what this was, and when you look at the football, the gray part of the football is actually a hard plastic. And the design of it is you open that up, you draw out your football plays, close it back up and throw it. But they didn't really account for the foreseeable use aspect of when you have an object being thrown at velocity that has hard plastic edges on it. When that compresses, when the foam part of it compresses, you're left with a hard plastic edge hitting people. They end up with 9 reports of facial injuries, including 8 requiring stitches. This product complied with all toy standards that were out there. And to this day, this product would pass. If you send it in for testing to ASTM F963 or EN71, it would actually pass those standards today, yet the product was still considered to present a substantial defect or a substantial hazard. This was a product sold in Europe that is called a spinner toy. And while it's difficult to tell from the picture versus an actual sample, like some of the ones that I have, as you spin this product faster and faster, there's 2 plastic blades that actually come out of the side of it that is attached by rubber bands, and it basically creates a spinning saw blade. And the company ended up with an incident where the blades actually cut through a child's lips and nose. But as of today, this product would still pass all of the standards out there. There's no regulations that would ban it, but it's still an unsafe product. Now, this process and discussion goes beyond just toys and children's items. Here's an example of a dumbbell weight that, because of a design defect, that the weights were not designed to lock on properly, the weights could fall off and create an impact hazard. So it goes beyond just toys and children's products. Other products fall under this also from a design standpoint. There are no standards for dumbbells or weight sets, but there's still safety issues. This is also one of my favorites. This is a lawn sprinkler that You attach a water hose on, but the problem was that the hose inside could begin to leak and fail, and the whole device would pressurize and cause the frog to explode. Now, I personally don't know of any standards out there for exploding frogs in the garden, but this is a product safety issue that wasn't foreseen, but could have been foreseen with a proper risk assessment process. Lowe's had a bug zapper a while ago that, when it is used in high humid conditions, and if it wasn't cleaned out, well, let's just stop and talk foreseeable use. How many of you are going to scrape dead bugs out of the bottom of a bug zapper like this? You combine those two foreseeable conditions and the units caught fire. So again, foreseeable use, understanding risk assessment would help avoid many of these recalls. There's also penalties even beyond recalls. Some of you may be aware of this incident. It was actually in the news earlier this year and last year that goes beyond even normal consumer products. This was a water park that was designed, and unfortunately it was designed in such a way that the speed and the velocities and design of it caused the raft to actually lift off the track. And there's an incident where there was a death, and there's actually lawsuits, and in fact the designer and owner end up being arrested by federal agents. So this is a pretty extreme example of where the failure of having a good design process and risk assessment process can cause an issue. So how do we look at this? What is the type of process we need to look at in order to focus on these design issues? When we talk about risk, let's first talk a little bit about definition. If you go into all different dictionaries and articles out there, there's a lot of different definitions of risk. My favorite one is the first one there, the statistical odds of danger. It just sounds exciting. But if you go through all of this and you summarize all of the definitions, you can simply state that risk is the probability of having an incident with a product. For consumers, that could be serious injury or death. But as a corporation or as a brand, you're going to lose brand value, have financial liability, and ultimately customer satisfaction. Now, the basic engine in order to make all this work is to change your way of thinking from it being a pass-fail to a standard to how do you manage the risk by using the concept of the risk equation. Now, the risk equation is not unique or novel. It's been around for decades. It's used in a lot of different industries, but it's how do you apply it for consumer products? And what you have to understand is risk is, you have to understand the potential hazard of a product as well as the potential exposure. I think all of us, it makes sense that if you have a product that has substantial hazards, you're going to have a significant amount of risk. That's a pretty easy one to think about. But what happens in today's age as volume goes up? What most companies fail to realize is, let's say you have a product that has a low risk of something happening, but now you increase your exposure. Well, your risk ends up going up just as much. Even though there might be a less chance of that hazard being an issue, that exposure multiplier is what's going to cause your risk to become unacceptable. So now you have two choices. You can manage risk by controlling exposure. I don't know of too many sales and marketing companies that want to go that approach. So really the best approach is to find a way to drive hazard to approximate zero. And if you notice my carefully chosen word, it's to approximate zero. You can never eliminate every single hazard out of every single product, but by having a process that analyzes the risk, understands them, and allows you to manage the ones that you can manage, reduce it, that is the way to manage your overall risk. But to do this, you have to think in different terms. Like I said, instead of pass and fail, you have to start thinking in terms of what is the probability of something happening? What's the severity of the potential injury? You have to look at design defects as well as manufacturing, but you really have to consider what is the foreseeable use of the product. Not how you want it to be used, but how is it likely to be used. You then have to factor in potential quantities, the durability of the product, how long it's going to be in the marketplace, as well as many other factors. And it's how you engage all of these together to really help you manage risk. Now, as you go throughout the business process and working through this, you have to understand that as you go from concept to distribution, you have a lot of time being invested. Not just in the cost of, or in the time of, a single person, but look at the number of teams that are involved as you get through each of these stages, the number of people that have touched, the amount of time invested in the research and development and design and tooling, and all of those factors. You have a lot of money being spent. You know, it's very different if you look at changing something in the concept stage when something's a sketch on a piece of paper versus having a 32 cavity injection dye tool that maybe is costing $100,000. Very different cost to scale as you're dealing with the money throughout that. But really one of the hardest parts is the emotional investment that's going on throughout the process. You go to a designer when it's a sketch on a piece of paper and you say, hey, you know, there might be an issue with this. What about if you were to do it like this instead? They're much more open than once they have a prototype in their hand and they're carrying it to you, cradling it in their hands. And if you say something is wrong at that point, it's like you're saying that their baby is ugly. They're not going to be happy with you. They're going to fight you. So what the whole point of this is, the further up in the business process you put these processes, the better off you are. But unfortunately, the traditional point of safety is done after development. The problem, though, is there's already now a huge amount of emotional energy put into it, time and money, to get a product to that point. By putting a safety gate at that stage is very problematic. You're either going to compromise the design or end up stopping the product altogether. An even worse place is once you have production going. I've been there, I've been involved with those. Those are not fun meetings to have. So the whole point to this is the earlier you push this up in the process, the better it's going to be for your business, as well as everybody involved with that. But it does come with a challenge, is you end up having to look at more products. I'm going to talk a little bit later about how to help manage issues like that with large assortments and how to effectively deal with that. So one of the parts that I wanted to add into our discussion today was a little bit of a section talking about establishing a safety culture. So we talked a little bit about the business process as a whole, but what about if you're in a company right now that doesn't really have a robust safety process? The first step to any product risk assessment process is really getting engagement with the company and making sure that there's the support with that. I wanted to add a couple slides to talk through some of the key factors with that. So when you look at establishing a safety culture within a company, I'm going to talk briefly about 5 different areas. So starting off, top management support. This is by far the most critical factor in order to implement and develop a product safety culture in a company. Without it, you're really not going to be successful. Budgets, processes, staffing all depend on getting the right support. But the more important part is the empowerment and the backing that has to come top down, because when tough decisions have to be made, if management is going to look at financial results over risk, you're never going to be successful in getting in a good product risk assessment process. So this is by far, in my experience, one of the top issues that I've found in getting the right thing done in a company is really getting the top management engaged. And honestly, what I've seen is you have 3 types. You have top management who gets it. They've been involved in past issues. They understand the importance. They know it. They support it. Those are the ones that you have the easiest time to sell to. Because they get it. They've been there, they've been in the trenches, and it's an easy sell. You then have top management that are willing to get it, but you're going to have to educate them. So with a little bit of education and time, you can teach them enough where it clicks. They're smart enough to piece the puzzle pieces together and know where it's going and say, you know what, you're right, I understand that, we do need to support this. But I'll tell you, I've also experienced times where there is top management who simply doesn't get it, and no matter how much you try to educate them and stuff like that, they simply aren't going to get it. I frankly haven't found any way around that. Those tend to be the companies that will only learn after several issues go on and they're either forced to change or that management leaves out and you get different management. So part of this is really understanding where are you and how to manage that. From a reporting structure standpoint, there's no single best answer to this. I've seen product safety and quality departments report up through legal, operations, product development, even directly to the president with its own reporting channel. The only thing that I say about this is the operations and product development departments tend to be the most problematic ones because of the potential for conflict of interest. It takes very strong leadership within those departments to actually effectively manage the conflict of interest. If you don't have that, you're always better off having these areas report to legal or other areas. But every one of these aspects has its risk as well as its pros. But there's no one single best solution for this. When you look at company culture drilling down into the departments, top management by far is ultimately determines the success. But the more that departments are actually integrated and made part of the solution, rather than having product safety departments isolated in silos, the more successful you're going to be is having them integrated and having them part of the process and part of the decision making. In that case, departments are going to seek help earlier in the process rather than wait for things to be found later. They'll be less likely to try to work around the process and sneak things around. So where I've seen this happen most is when you deal in technical fields, that's where you tend to have the highest level of integration because the technical people get it. They understand the processes, they understand the need. And most of the time in tech fields or tech products, you tend to have a much higher level of engagement with product safety and integrating in departments. The areas that I've seen the most problematic are the more creative companies. And when you think about it, the people in creative companies are different thinking. They're not process thinkers. They don't want to be structured within confines. They just want to be creative and freewheeling. Those are the ones that tend to have a lot more education and a lot more oversight over the processes within those companies. How resources are applied is a huge part to having a successful program also. Good intentions alone are not going to do it. You have to have money budgeted for testing and development and training. You have to have the right staff in place in order to really drive the process. But what I've seen is, companies that invest most in the processes, for example, they invest the time and money into FMEAs or the R&D aspect of this. These are the ones that really tend to do a really good job around focusing on product safety beyond the standards. So you have to make sure you get the resources as well. And then the last key factor to talk about is the decision-making process. And again, I've seen a variety of ways for this being done. I've seen individual responsibility for safety decisions, although that can be very challenging at times because a single person can have their own biases and maybe gets a myopic view of things and is difficult to get off of that. Some of the better run programs that I've seen over my career have had safety committees, be it a small group or a larger group, that make the final risk decisions. These committees empower the teams to manage the process, but they have oversight or final decision-making ability. But the key to this is making sure that the right people are involved that have different ways of thinking. The last thing you want is a safety committee that everybody on that committee thinks the exact same way. Why have a committee at that point? You have to have discourse, you have to have disagreement and challenging to make the best decision for the company. So all of the key factors are important, but as I stated, it all starts with top management support. Without that, you're really going to challenge with setting up a program in a company. So the larger the company is, the more difficult it is to change existing processes and to change the culture. But again, with the right empowerment, with the right committees and the right cross-functional groups, it can be done. It's just the larger the company is, the more challenging it becomes. So what are some ways to do it? If you're looking at having to do change management and change culture in the company, the first thing that you want to do is assess where are you? Have an honest discussion within the company that says, where do we believe we are right now? Are we lagging? Are we leading? But, really have an honest assessment of where we are. But then from there, you have to have the discussion of where do we want to be from a brand risk management. And I'll tell you, I've on a consulting basis, I've had several discussions with companies like this where the first question is, okay, what's your risk tolerance? Where do you want to be? Because if you're coming in and you're pitching a world-class program for the highest brand protection, but that company is only willing to be at a level 4, everything you say is going to fall on deaf ears. So there are ways to manage the program within this matrix, but set the expectations, make sure that it's understood. what is the company signing up for? Make sure that they understand the pros and cons with what brand risk level they're taking on. They make an informed decision, and then you structure a program that meets that risk level. If you try to do anything otherwise, no matter how passionate you are about it, if the risk appetite isn't there, you aren't going to be successful. So I strongly recommend this two-part assessment of where are you now, where is the company willing to go, and where do they want to go. You can always reassess later on and come back and keep creeping it, but you have to sort of set the expectation, and there's a lot of different ways to do that within this chart. So now going into some of the tools. This is sort of the meat of the process. Now, I only have an hour to speak. I actually sometimes talk for 3 days on this topic, so you'll have to excuse me for being brief here, but I'll at least give you a little bit of a taste of some of the tools that are out there. But more importantly, it's a different way of thinking about product safety to sort of spark the idea in your head of where you can go. So for those of you that know FMEA or DFMEA, that alone is a risk assessment process. So if you aren't really sure where to start with a risk assessment process, start by really going into FMEA and understanding the principles. When you walk through an FMEA process, the whole part of it is you brainstorm the foreseeable uses. You look at failure modes. You look at the effects and hazards. You classify them, but then what you do is you prioritize and manage the risk in order to lower your risk score. So the process is exactly the same when you look at risk assessment. It follows an FMEA process. But what I'm going to share with you is some of the steps that enhance an FMEA process to make it more effective. Because while each of the steps are important, it's how you execute those steps that's really critical. So when you're in risk assessment, the first step that I always talk about is having an effective data analysis. Data is crucial. You have to be able to learn from past experiences, past data, past characteristics to really understand the full profile of risk. There are a lot of resources out there from a recall standpoint. The best sources obviously are the US SPSP public database. RAPEX is decent, although I'll tell you most of the recalls in RAPEX are more to the directives. There's very few risk assessment based recalls in Europe. In the US, you find a lot more of those categories. But really, the injury database, there's a publicly available injury database on the CPSC's website under NICE that is a very powerful tool if you can learn how to use it effectively. You can download all sorts of injuries for specific product types. You can slice it and dice it in several different ways. But the thing that I want to emphasize with injury data is this. You can use injury data to make pretty charts. So like in this one here, I'd done a research project a while ago on trampolines. So yeah, I can make pretty charts showing the ages and the gender profiles and all these other things. What it all comes down to, an effective injury data analysis, comes down to analyzing the characteristics. You have to read the incidents and actually get into what happened and try to really figure out the nuts and bolts of what happened. Now, understand any instant data that's out there is going to be biased. You aren't going to have 100% truth in every single instant, but as you read through enough of them, you start to develop trends. You end up making your own chart as you're reading instant after instant after instant, and you start noticing trends. And it's those trends that will help to identify characteristics or foreseeable use behaviors that you now need to build into your product. But there's also these rare nuggets that as you're going through the data, a single instant can spark an idea about a product safety issue. Now, in this case of the trampoline, looking at some of these, like the first specific instant, a person being struck by a support pole that collapsed during use. That right there opens up the door of, wow, okay, so if we're doing safety supports, we need to make sure that those are designed in a way that has them really solid. And let's think through all the different foreseeable uses that could impact those safety supports and design around it. Now, the standards for trampolines have come a long way over the past 2 decades, and a lot of these things are addressed in the standards. but you can still learn from the injury data, and you can learn about those characteristics and say, what if? What is the foreseeable use that I learned? What is the hazardous characteristic? The second step is foreseeable use. Now, understand foreseeable use is more about just learning of the different uses. It's not judging them. Like in this last example here, just because someone could use a broom to reach up high, does that mean we have to make all brooms 4 inches tall? Well, no. All that's saying is that's a foreseeable use. Are there any unreasonable risks that come of that, and can those be mitigated in the design of the product, and should they be? So foreseeable use is more about a process asking the question than a decision making. There's a lot of things about foreseeable use that you have to look at, everything from attractiveness to how careful consumers will be, but it's also not about just children. There's foreseeable use with adults, the elderly, and each of those categories have different risk factors that impact them that you have to consider and think through to know what is the true potential risk of the product. So when you're brainstorming foreseeable uses in your FMEA process, it's not just saying how you want people to use the product, it's how they're likely to use it and what are the risks involved with that. The third section of a risk assessment, the final part though, is the hazard analysis. Now this is an eye chart. There's a lot of details on this chart, but at the end of the day, what this is all about is having a systematic approach to look at the potential hazards, but more importantly, knowing what do those hazards really mean and what do they do. You have to have a process around this. So a hazards analysis is not just looking to the standards and saying, oh, the standard says do this. What an effective hazard analysis is going to do is you start off looking at the standards because that's a good place to start. But then you have to understand the anatomy. How does the human anatomy become associated with that hazard and what are the risks around that? You have to understand the mechanism. How does that injury actually occur? And then study the injuries that are associated with that hazard to really understand the behaviors that lead to it, mechanisms, and as well as the potential severity. In some cases, there are very specific product characteristics that lead to specific hazards. So the more you learn about those, the more that you can design around them. But this is not just simply saying, oh, the standard says we have to test to this and we're done. This is a process that you have to go through. So just as an example, I'm going to touch briefly on choking hazards. Definitely a child-specific issue. A lot of my background was with toys and children's products. But again, this process goes well beyond that into adult products and many other consumer products. But when you look at choking hazards with children's products, and you look at what the standard is, the small parts test cylinder, once you start to realize that the standard, while it's decent, it's definitely saved a lot of children over time, even from the first time that it was incepted in the 1970s, very soon after it came out, there was a product that was involved in several fatalities, the Fisher-Price Little people, due to their characteristics were a hazard, but they passed the standard. So what unfortunately happened was instead of going back and revisiting the standard in the small parts test cylinder, what was decided was to create a separate standard. And if you go back and research this, you'll actually see the history behind this. When this first happened, what ended up happening was instead of changing the small parts test cylinder, they created a new gauge called the supplemental test fixture. And the first time that that gauge came into place, the only products that applied to it were preschool figurines without appendages. So they basically created a standard to fail the specific product that was involved in injuries or in fatalities, instead of going back to really assess, well, is our small parts test cylinder correct? Over the years, several other products that have been involved in instance have now been added onto this additional standard. So again, if you look at the data and you look at the process, that's a good place to start to understand is how effective is the standard that's out there. When you look at some of the data that's out there, when you look at known toy fatalities, the small parts test cylinder failed to catch about 28% of the fatalities. Well, if I'm designing toys, that's not a really good percentage rate for me. I wouldn't really find that acceptable as the bare minimum standard that I'm going to meet. I definitely want to sort of up it up and look at more. So to do that, you have to go through the process. What does the injury data say? Well, The magic number for airway obstruction is 3 and under, right? You know, warning, this product may contain small parts not suitable for children under 3. Well, the data indicates that it's not just children under 3. There's also older children, especially 4, 5, 6-year-olds that are just about as at much risk. So that's something for me to consider as I'm designing products, especially if I'm designing them for 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds. Maybe I want to step up my airway obstruction hazard. Understanding the anatomy is a key part, but then it's looking at what other tools are out there. So there are some companies out in the industry. These gauges right here are actually used by McDonald's for their Happy Meal toys. Other companies have adopted them also because these are a much more stringent way, a safer way of looking at airway obstruction hazard that truly addresses the risk of airway obstruction. Now, would I recommend these for every single toy in existence? No. But if I'm managing my risk and I have a younger child product, I would absolutely use these in order to manage my risk on those products while maybe allowing other products to go forward that don't comply with this standard and only meet the small parts test cylinder. It's about risk and how do you apply that. So this is just one example from a hazard standpoint, looking at the characteristics that make something dangerous for airway obstruction. It's not just about the small parts test cylinder. It's what's the length of the product, what's the critical size, what's the critical shape. It's how all of those characteristics combine together to create a potential airway obstruction hazard. That's what you have to look at, not just whether or not it passes or fails a gauge. It is challenging to do this, especially when you look at the breadth of hazards that's out there. But if you want an effective risk assessment process, these are the steps that you have to go through. So now the question is, what do you do with that data? There's a lot of different ways in order to look at this. Sorry, I'm having an issue with PowerPoint. The risk management techniques, I'm sorry, my PowerPoint just crashed. Let me get this back up. All right, we're back up and running here. There are several different risk management techniques out there. The first to start off with is looking at what does the CPSC do? So the CPSC actually looks at a lot of different factors. When they identify a potential hazard, they start asking questions about it. So if you identify a hazard, these are valid questions to ask. What's the utility of the product? What's the need? What's the historical experience? And from that, build in decision making. They also look at what's the pattern of the defect, how many products are distributed in commerce, what's the severity of the risk, the likelihood of injury. Now, the thing that I find fascinating about CPSC is they have a handbook out there that actually helps guide all of this. Now, at the end of this chapter, they have a small paragraph that says, oh, and by the way, a substantial product hazard also exists if a product doesn't comply with an applicable rule. All of these other factors that I just talked about, severity of risk, likelihood of injury, is all for products assumed to meet the standards. So what is the CPSC doing? They're doing a risk assessment. If you look at these characteristics, these are the exact same characteristics outlined in that risk equation that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. So that's really telling when you look at how the CPSC looks at it. But they go one step further and they classify their hazards, because not all hazards are the same. They have 3 different classifications that they use based off the severity of the risk of death or serious injury. This is really telling also. So as you're identifying hazards with your product, you need to understand what's the potential severity and then use that as part of your risk decision-making ability. If you have a product that has a minor concern but it's going to cost a substantial amount of money in order to address the hazard, maybe that's not a large enough risk to manage. Maybe that's an acceptable risk. Maybe you find other ways to manage that through labeling or something else. But if the hazard you identify as a critical concern, a Class A hazard, that's one that you probably need to invest the money to fix or don't do the product. So that's how you can classify your hazards and actually build that into a risk decision. Some companies use these risk matrix charts where they set a company policy that says we're not going to deal with any product design features that are in the red, or maybe other companies will say orange, or maybe if you're a children's product company or a juvenile product company, you even decide we don't even want anything in the yellow because of the group of consumers we're targeting. Every single one of these is a company decision, and that's what makes risk assessment so hard to govern, is you can't legislate a risk decision. It all depends on what your risk tolerance is and how much risk are you willing to take on, and how do you want to manage those risks. There are a lot of different ways. You can, the best way to manage a risk is you design it out. Once you design the hazard out of a product, you have effectively eliminated the risk. Now, that's not always possible, but per the risk equation, if you can drive hazard to approximate zero, that is the most effective way to manage risk. But what if you can't do that? What if you can't design it out? There are ways to protect or safeguard. Think about drain cleaner. Drain cleaner comes in child-proof bottles. Now, could they design the hazard out of drain cleaner and make it so it's non-toxic? Sure they can. It's probably not going to clean drains though. So the way that they manage the risk of that is put it into child-proof bottles to protect or safeguard against the hazard, to make it less accessible. That's an effective way to manage risk. Maybe in some cases, if you're dealing with more industrial type products, or products that are installed or serviced by companies, maybe a risk level is to train those that are at risk in order to prevent the misuse or injury, and have a training program with that. Or warnings and instructions. But warnings and instructions are not the most effective way. If you look at the data associated with it, they're highly ineffective. So warnings and instructions should not be the only risk management strategy, but they are one. If you have done everything you can to drive hazard to approximate zero, those are an effective way in order to close the gap on some of those other issues. Now, how does this apply to a large mix of products? So, I've dealt with companies that have had anywhere from 150 products in their product line up to 25,000 products in their product line, and I've consulted for companies that have well beyond that. So the trick to this is to prioritize. Screen the products. Have a way to screen out the low-risk products from the high-risk products and spend your resources on the high-risk products. You don't need to do a risk assessment on every single product in an assortment, but you should focus those resources on higher risk products. How do you define those? That's going to be up to every company to decide how to define. I'll give you some ideas in a little bit, but this is the best way to manage it. Then what you have to do is decide, are you going to develop the expertise internally to manage everything, or are you going to outsource it? I've worked with companies that have done both ways, and there's, again, no right way to do it. It's a matter of choice and risk management. There are some ways to manage risk within a product assortment where you screen it and you apply different guidelines depending on the risk of the product. So like this is one that if you had an assortment of children's products from young to older children to even adult products, this could be an effective way to filter out those products and apply different guidelines depending on the different risk levels. And then with those guidelines, you develop a chart like this that says, okay, for those high-risk products, we're going to do a full risk assessment. No small parts are going to be allowed. The gauge requirement has to be met. You basically apply the most stringent requirements to those high-risk products to lower and drive hazard to approximate zero. While the lower risk products, you don't spend as much resources. You rely more on the standards that are out there, knowing that those are lower risk to begin with. But this is how you start to filter through a large assortment in order to get through, to really focus on those that are going to cause the problems. What are some of the ways to do it? Well, product risk level, you can look at material types, the features or category of consumer, the method of construction. There's a whole list of different ways that you can define the risk level. But one other strategy that I'm going to talk about is supplier risk level, that based on your supplier risk, you can start working on various charts where you take your product risk level, combine it with your supplier risk level, and now you develop all sorts of different ways of managing stuff. You can manage your testing based on a risk level and make sure that if you have a low risk supplier, don't test as much. Maybe you put out testing every 3 years or 2 years, depending on the product risk level. Maybe if you have a high-risk supplier doing a high-risk product, you're going to be testing every single production run. But again, it's a risk-based methodology based off of data and having different ways of applying it based on the overall risk to the company. You can apply it to inspection results. I'm personally applying it to social compliance auditing as well, and we're stratifying our factories. We're using the same principles in a lot of different ways to manage risk for our business. You can put in entire test programs and test matrices that look at, based on the risk level of your materials or your components with your vendor risk level, have very specific testing based off of that could range from testing every shipment to conducting no testing at all and just relying on your vendor certifications. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes to get a program up and running like this, but this is the way to make wise use of your money and to use it in a way that manage your risk while also managing your resources. I've worked with companies to develop risk-based test plans that, based off the risk level of specific test, whether or not you actually conduct the testing yourself, if you rely on vendor certification, or if you just simply ignore it altogether and don't worry about it because it's just such a low risk. You have to have a lot of data going in behind, like what's the actual risk of the chemical and how dangerous is it? What's the risk of it showing up in that type of product? So like in this case for footwear, knowing that certain materials are going to have a higher risk of containing certain chemicals, those are the materials that you focus on testing versus a one-size-fits-all, everything's going to be tested to everything. You can do the same thing, like here's an example with jewelry, where you can look at some of the different laws and make decisions on whether or not you're going to focus on excessive testing or documentation for that law, or rely on your other testing or certifications to comply with that. But overall, it's all about risk and how you manage it. It's about having a process around doing that. So that's all I had for today. I know it's sort of a whirlwind. Again, all the slides will be available afterwards. I'll also have my contact information available if anyone has specific follow-ups that you'd like to dialogue with me on afterwards. Let me turn this back over to Laurel then to wrap up.
Hi, Don. First off, I'm going to go over we had a couple of questions posed during the webinar. We have about 5 minutes left. And so I'm going to go ahead and ask a few of those, if that's cool.
Sure.
Perfect. Let's see. We've got one person asked, what are the colors on slide 54?
Colors, slide 54. Let me quickly go back.
54, yes.
Oh, the colors were male and female. So.
Okay, wonderful. We had one question with that. Let's see, another one. Who within an organization typically sets the business risk tolerance?
It's different for each organization. Most of the time you end up working with a combination of legal departments combined with sometimes finance, depending on who manages risk within the organization. But most time you're going to be engaging with senior leadership, and it varies. So like if you're in a privately held company, I've been in a couple privately held companies, most of the time it ends up going up to the owner of the company and a discussion is being had with them on what their risk tolerance is, since it's their company, their name, their brand. As you get into more publicly traded companies, you tend to have either the board of directors or someone who's empowered in order to make those decisions from a risk standpoint. But almost always it's going to involve an element of legal, an element of compliance, and then some level of senior leadership within the company to collectively make those decisions. But ultimately, once that group sort of sets it, it's all about empowering a group of people to ultimately work with that. So like one of the brands that I work with that I used to consult for actually had a safety committee that was empowered to make all of those decisions. They did not have to go up to management for every one of their decisions. That committee was empowered to make the final decisions because they had the right processes and the right people in that committee.
Wonderful. Okay, here's another one. For general consumer products, is there a guideline for the lifespan of a test report per CPSC?
Under CPSIA, the reasonable testing program, typically the rule of thumb has been a year, but that can change depending on the product type, the risk, the production schedule. Sometimes it goes to 6 months, sometimes 2 years. So the CPSC really backed off on prescribing a definitive. Their general guideline is annual, but there's so many factors that, again, if you look at it from a risk-based standpoint, you can justify even going out to 2 or 3 years, depending on the product, the production cycle, and the risk. But there are some statutory requirements that, depending on the product, I don't want to answer generically for every product category, because some products do have more prescribed requirements out there. But in general, there's some flexibility. CPSIA general rule is annually.
Wonderful. And we have one more. Do you have any thoughts on how much drug and alcohol impairment should be factors considered during risk assessments for consumer products?
It's funny. I actually, in my more detailed training courses that I do, I actually go deeply into that. Well, not deeply, but it's an entire section that I cover in my foreseeable use with adult foreseeable use, because that is a very key factor to look at. And the way that I talk about it is it comes down to your reasonable foreseeable use. The way that I always talk about is, do you have to design every single product as though someone who's blind drunk is going to use it? No, you don't. There's still that reasonable expectation of foreseeable use. However, if you're designing a product that is going to be a bar game, well, guess what? Now you do have to assume that the person's going to be blind drunk playing it, and you have to manage your risk accordingly with that. If you are making a party game, you're going to have to assume there's a higher risk. So blind, either physical impairments caused by alcohol or even physical impairments that are by the nature of the person, physically handicapped people, they are all risk factors that you need to consider as part of your reasonable foreseeable use assessment that you're doing, and then factor that into your design. And if you can design the product to be safer in that scenario and not take away from the features and not add significant costs, then why not do it? But it wouldn't be mandatory for every single product.
Okay, and where do you draw the line with reasonable foreseeable use?
There is no good answer for that. It really comes down to subjective experience, and really that's where having an informed safety committee or a risk decision group or multiple people who think different ways, not to say that it's consensus, but a lot of times it comes down to consensus. I'll be perfectly honest with you. It comes down to personal experience. It comes down to looking at injury data. And for me, a lot of times it comes down to, in those situations where there's question, I look heavily more on the hazard analysis to understand the potential risk. But this is one of the biggest factors of why risk assessments will never be able to be regulated and mandated in a prescribed way, is because there's no way to answer that question definitively. The unfortunate answer is it depends. But if you're using a good risk assessment process, you're looking at what does the data analysis tell you. If you're doing a risk assessment and you're looking at reasonable risk, at the end of the day, it comes down to there's going to be a risk associated with different uses. You can go into detailed probability analyses and actually do, really deep dives depending on the scope of the product and how deep it is. But that really is an extremely difficult and very salient question. I get that question a lot in my training courses. It's just unfortunately not easy to answer.
Yeah, they said I was afraid he would say that. That's funny. So one last question that we just got in is, where do you find the narratives on NEI-SS data?
If you download the data out of the CPSC database, so you can go online. The NICE data is accessible through the CPSC website. It's kind of convoluted to get there, but once you get into the data, you can actually put in your product code that you're looking at. So everything is coded in the NICE data. Once you find your product code, you put that into the database, and you can actually export the data into an Excel spreadsheet. And in the CPSC NICE data, there is a column that that is a narrative. They actually have, I think it's 3 columns. It's broken up because of the amount of text, they break it up into 3 columns. But the narrative actually is there in the raw data. And so I worked with companies in the past. So like one of the first 2 consulting companies I worked for, we actually worked with CPSC and had them send us all of their data. So it's millions of data points. And we put it into a software program that would allow us to do our own research on it. Online, you can only look at 1 year worth of data at a time, so that becomes difficult. You have to do a lot of downloading and piece it all together. But if you have the resources, you can get a full download from the CPSC from 1983 all the way to current if you can manage the data yourself. But otherwise, you can download a year at a time, export it into an Excel file. The narrative column is in there in the raw data when you export it.
Okay, well, wonderful. Well, Don, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. The webinar recording will be available on our website by the beginning of next week in the webinar archive tab. For those of you that have submitted questions, we answered pretty much all of them. Thank you so much for submitting questions. We love to know that you're listening and that you're wanting to learn more. Please continue to watch for announcements about upcoming webinars in our SPSP series. Y'all all have a wonderful day.